Lesson 9, page 38. Lesson 8 was online last week. If you didn't get the chance to do that, you can go look at that. I uploaded it a few days ago, so I was a little late on that. You have to push the publish button, apparently, after you upload it before people can actually see it. So I'm learning new things all the time. But it's published and it's up, so you can go catch up on that if you didn't get to it. And that, of course, was Judges and Ruth. So we're not going to talk about those this week. We're going to start with 1 Samuel. Now I'm going to start here just to get our brains moving. I have all these names up here, and we're just going to kind of scroll through these. These are all people who are in the book of 1 Samuel. And so we're going to talk about each of these, but I want to just give a little pre-quiz and see if you guys have any idea who these people are. What about Hannah? Does anyone know? And a lot of these you'll notice, I mean, think about this. This is thousands of years ago. These people and their lives were so impactful that their names have carried on, many of them, all these years later. So Hannah, who is Hannah? Does anybody remember? She was someone's mom. She was Samuel's mom. I'm going to tell that story here in just a moment. Who was Saul? He was the first king, right? He was the first king from the tribe of Benjamin, big tall guy. And then who was Jesse? He was David's father, and he was, remember we did it last week, he's somebody's grandson, who's also the book before Samuel, right? That's Ruth and Boaz's grandson. And he is Jonathan, if we come down here at the bottom, he was Saul's son, and he was also David's best friend. Soul brother. That was his soul brother, that's right. And then, of course, we have Goliath here in the middle. Goliath, as we know, is tied in with David. And Goliath was one of the Philistines. We're going to talk about the Philistines here in a little bit more detail. And then I'm going to jump over here. Now, this is more advanced side, okay? We're going to get a little more advanced over here. All right, Eli. Who knows who Eli was? Or Eli. I knew a guy in India named Eli. He was a judge, and he was the priest. He was the one who Hannah is going to come to in Ramah, in that place of worship. And Samuel lived with Eli after he was dedicated to God. What about, here's a hard one, Phineas. Now, you know Phineas and Ferb. Do you have kids? Y'all know who Phineas and Ferb? Okay, this is Phineas. This name has also endured through cartoons on whatever Cartoon Network or where it is. Phineas. Does anyone know who Phineas was? By the way, this would not be on my top 1,000 choice to name my son. That'll give you a hint. Was not a good guy. Yes, he was Phineas, and Hophni was the other. They were two brothers that were so corrupt they would steal from people's offerings. They were sexually immoral, and eventually they were killed in judgment who we're going to talk about in a moment, by the Philistines. And then, of course, Eli was the father. Now, what about this? Is also a name that's famous in America. Now, why is this name famous? Ichabod Crane. Now, who's Ichabod Crane? Legend, remember the Headless Horseman, the Sleepy Hollow, Ichabod. I can't remember the actual story. I know this one. Anyway, he's in that story. We all know the name Ichabod. It's also endured, but Ichabod is the grandson of Eli. So Ichabod is Phineas's son. Now, it's really, the reason I put it in here, it's really kind of a fascinating story. After Phineas and his brother die, their father gets the news that his sons have died. The Ark of the Covenant has been carried away. He literally falls off his chair and dies, breaks his neck. And then almost immediately after that, Phineas's wife has a son. And because of all that's happened, the Ark of the Covenant's been carried off, the priest has died, his sons have died. She names her son Ichabod, which means the glory of God has departed. And so the name of Ichabod means the glory of God has departed, and that was Ichabod, who was born right at the time of this key event that we're going to read about in the book of 1 Samuel. And then, of course, we have another name that's you can still meet people named Abigail today. Who was Abigail? Another name from 1 Samuel that has endured. Wife of a bad guy. That's actually true, and also a wife of a good guy. Different guys, right? So if you'll remember Abigail, she was, I think, the second wife of David. So after David married, you remember we're here a little bit, Saul gave his daughter to David. Then after David started having successes, Saul chased him off. Then Saul gave his first wife, Michal, to another guy. And as David was fleeing Abigail, who was married to a really bad guy, really corrupt bad guy, Abigail gave him help against the will of her husband. Then later her husband was killed. And then David came back into the scene and they got married. So she was a widow when David married her, and they had a son named Daniel. Okay, there you go. All these names, and we're going to kind of roll through all these. That was just a quick pop quiz. But one of the things I want to spend a little bit of time to also in this introduction, none of this is in your book, talking about the Philistines. Now I'm going to put a map up here on the TV, but you can turn to page 46 in your books. You have a very similar map on page 46. We're just going to talk a little bit about the Philistines. The Philistines, in the time of the judges, are always popping up as enemies. They're also going to be in the time of Saul and in the time of David. They're always going to be fighting against these different people. So I'm going to look at them a little bit on the map. Particularly here. Now you see this area here that's called Philistia. Now the Philistines, and I get this information, I'll put another plug. Has anybody bought this book yet? I've been plugging it almost every week. So this Holman Bible Dictionary, which is really good, you can look up Philistines. And it gives us a lot of good information about who they were. A lot of it's been discovered in the last 100 years, by the way. So that's why this stuff to me is more interesting now than it would have been if you were studying 100 years ago, because they're discovering things all the time. So the Philistines actually came from Greece. And they fled, and they're written about, the Philistines along with other people, they're referred to as the sea peoples from the Aegean Sea. The Aegean Sea is just where the Greek Isles are. So they came down and they invaded Egypt about 1100 BC. So after the Israelites, remember, they left about 1400 BC to come up into the Promised Land. So they were already in the Promised Land. The Philistines started invading all these areas with other sea peoples from Greece, and they were very advanced people. So they just came in overwhelmed because they came from Greece, where they had better blacksmiths, better ways to make weapons, a lot more technology. So that's why there weren't as many of them, but they had the best war technology. And the reason they lived on the sea is because they were constantly trading back and forth and bringing in troops and bringing in people. Their relatives think were coming in through this sea trade because they were called the sea people. So that's the Philistines. And we have here, speaking of a relatively recent discovery, this is an actual pot made by the Philistines that was discovered in the Holy Land. And the really neat thing that you look at is this is just a picture of their soldiers. And if you look at it carefully, you'll start to see, or it looks familiar when you read the story about Goliath, when the Bible describes what he used with the long spear, which eventually, you remember Alexander the Great from Greece is going to conquer the world with these long spears as he makes that phalanx really organized and able to make that into a military weapon. So it's really fascinating. You can see these pictures they're discovering now that are described in the Bible, the only place in ancient text that these people are described. Okay, now on to the book of 1 Samuel, top of page 38. I think I've covered everything. Yes, I have. You'll see that first paragraph at the top of page 38. The book of 1 Samuel covers from the time of Samuel's childhood. Samuel is the final judge. So he's the person who carries over from the judges into the time of the kings. And it ends, the book of 1 Samuel ends with the death of King Saul. And the book of 1 and 2 Samuel, as it says in the second paragraph, and 1 and 2 Kings cover the complete history of Israel in the time of the kings, all the way to the time that they're carried off into exile. And if you look at, and I'm going to pass it around, this is a Hebrew Bible. So if you look in the Hebrew Bible, and I know we have a lot of people who can probably read this, right? No, but the one thing you have to trust me on this, I can't read it very well either, is that in this book, 1 and Samuel, it's all one book. So they divided it up when they made it to the English translations, but in the Hebrew Bible, Samuel, it's just the time of Samuel. It's actually all the time of the kings. And you can see a little bit more about that, but I was just going to pass that around so y'all can look at it. And by the way, it looks weird because, right, it looks backwards because these Semitic languages always go right to left. So the book goes this way in reverse. And when you get to the Hebrew part, it reads from right to left and down. So I'll just pass that around. Y'all can take a look at that. Okay, and you can see the middle of page 38. It's kind of divided up into three parts. The life of Samuel, or the ministry of Samuel. Then we talk about the time of Saul, and then the time of David. Most of the life of David is going to be covered in the 2 Samuel, but we'll talk about a little bit the first part of it before he becomes king in the book of 1 Samuel. So now let me tell you a story about Hannah. So Hannah was the wife of a man named Elkanah. His name's not quite as famous. It didn't quite endure as long as Hannah. I don't know why. And he had another wife called Peninnah. That name also didn't endure, but Hannah's did. And so Peninnah had many children. Hannah had no children. And that's a big deal back in those times. You have to remember, this is a tribal culture. There was no civilization. There was no real law and order. So the only way that your family prospered in future generations was through, guess what? Children. So you had as many children as you could. And particularly, you didn't want to have sons because they would be the ones that would be able to fight and be able to protect your family. So sons were very important. And so Peninnah, it's having, and so Hannah, if you were barren, not having children, you saw yourself as cursed and people kind of looked down on you. And so Hannah, as they came every year, the family would travel to this city called Ramah, where Eli was the priest. There was a sort of a worship center, a place where you could go and do sacrifices. They came there one year. Hannah went into the sort of tabernacle type of area, the temporary place where they come for worship, and she was just crying in tears, pouring her heart out to the Lord, asking God if she could just have a son. And Eli, who was the priest, he was sitting on the other side of the court. He sees her over there and thinks she's drunk because she's apparently just overcome with her grief. And so he comes up to her and kind of scolds her and says, "What are you doing in here, drinking and all that?" She says, "I'm not drinking. I'm just pouring out my heart to the Lord." And Eli says, "May the Lord grant to you whatever you've requested of God." And the covenant Hannah made with God, as we see here in chapter 1, verse 11, she asked that she would have a male child, and then she made another request or a promise to God, which you'll see at the bottom of page 38. This is the first answer that you have, and the second one is here at the bottom. It's also found in the 11th verse. It says, if God will give her a male child, that she will give her son to the Lord. And when the family returned a year later, guess what? She had a son, and her son's name was Samuel. And so turn over to page 39. Yes, and he was a Nazirite. So that was part. We've talked about that a little bit a few lessons ago. The Nazirite vow. And there's another very famous person who wasn't quite as good a guy, Samson, right, who had the same vow. So often when people would make covenants or promises to God, they would dedicate a child to God, then they would dedicate them, and the sort of the outward sign people would see of them is that they would have long hair. So you would see them coming through. You'd know that's a holy person who's been dedicated to the Lord. So they'd have long hair, and they'd have all these dietary restrictions as well. So he was also a Nazirite, just like a Samson was supposed to be. And so on the page 39, he blesses him with a son, and they come back to the tabernacle at Shiloh. And as we talked about, Eli and his sons, Phinehas and Hophni, were very corrupt. The system had become very corrupt. But still, when Samuel was weaned, and I don't know back then how long that went, but at least a couple of years probably, then she would leave him there at the temple. And there were other things that were in the temple. Also was in the temple was the Ark of the Covenant. Now, what is the Ark of the Covenant? Let's review a little bit from last week. The Ark of the Covenant was made, and what was put into the Ark of the Covenant? The commandments, some manna, and also one other thing. A staff. Remember when to show that Aaron was going to be the priestly family, they put all the staffs in front of it, and it was one that budded. And so they put also that staff to be in there, and apparently those buds remained on it so people would remember that Aaron's family was to be the priestly family. And so that was put on there, and also it was put into the tabernacle and into the Holy of Holies, where they would do the once a year the sacrifice of atonement. So this was the central figure, most important thing in the place in Israel. That was also in the place where Eli was serving in Shiloh. And you can see that third paragraph on page 39. These Philistines kept attacking, and they came and they ransacked the city. And as we talked about earlier in the introduction, Eli's sons, Phinehas, Hophni, were killed, and the Ark of the Covenant was carried off. And then news gets to Eli, and Eli, it says he was a heavy man. Now, what do you think that means? Obese. Probably. So he was obese, and he would sit on his chair at the gate, and it says when news came that his sons had died, and then he heard that the Ark of the Covenant had been carried away by the Philistines that we saw a map of earlier, it says he just fell off his chair, backwards off his chair, and it broke his neck, and he died on the spot. And so the Ark of the Covenant was carried away by the Philistines. We see that in the middle of page 39. And next we're going to be talking about the Philistines God. And I have a couple more pictures here. It just kind of adds a little color to it. So the Philistines had lots of gods. They were pagan gods. A lot of them, as I said, like in the places of Greek culture that they carried in, it was mixed with Assyrian gods. So the one that we're going to talk about now is this Dagon. Now this is an actual picture, and it's on, I forget, some painting that's in the Middle East. I've forgotten to put the exact details in here. This says where this one's at. But this is a picture of Dagon. Now Dagon was the chief god among the Philistine people because they were what? Sea peoples. Whom sea peoples make their living. How do you think they made their living? Probably from fish. So it was a fish-like being that had a human head and hands. That was the god Dagon that the Philistines worshipped. And then here is a picture of one of the priests who worked in the temple. So the Ark of the Covenant was carried away, and they took the Ark of the Covenant, the Philistines did, and they put it into a temple of Dagon. And it had a huge statue, idol of Dagon that was in the temple. And I'm going to read you what happened in that temple after the Philistines put it into the temple. You can read along with me if you want in chapter 5, verses 1 through 5 in 1 Samuel. It says, "Now the Philistines took the ark of the God and brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then the Philistines took the ark of God, that is the ark of the covenant, and brought it to the house of Dagon and set it by Dagon, this statue of this fish god. Then the Ashdodites rose up early the next morning." So they put the Ark of the Covenant in the temple where they have this huge statue. And the next morning, the people of the town get up and go into the temple, and this is what happened. Dagon, the temple, that big statue, had fallen on its face on the ground before the Ark of the Covenant, or the Ark of the Lord. So they got together, they picked it back up, and they stood it back up. They thought that's a really strange thing that would fall over. And then the next morning they came back in, and behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the Ark of the Covenant. And not only that, but the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were cut off. So the head and the hands were cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. And we'll have, that's of course the next answer. Is that the next morning Dagon had fallen on his face and broke off his hands and his feet. And actually it should say head there. Broke off his head and the palms of his hands, it says here. So not only that happened, but then there became these sicknesses, these strange plagues, and everyone became convinced that the Ark of the Covenant was a curse on them. So they did something that was pretty interesting. They decided that they would give it to the test. Is this just a random occurrence, or is this because of the Ark of the Covenant? Y'all remember this story? So they took the Ark of the Covenant, and they put it on a cart. And then they took 2 cows, and they put 2 cows that had never been yoked before, so they'd never poured a cart before. So put 2 cows on the yoke on this cart and put the Ark of the Covenant on that cart, and they put these other statues and things that their priests had prescribed and that were made of gold as an offering. And then they said, if this cart goes back to Israel, down the road, there are 2 ways the road could go. This cart goes back to Israel, we'll know that it was the Ark of the Covenant that caused this to happen. It's been this Yahweh, this God who is cursing us. But if it doesn't, we'll know it was just a random chance occurrence. And guess what the cows did? It says that they immediately turned without anyone driving them and went up back into the land of Israel. And there's a note someone asked a couple weeks ago about the Ark of the Covenant, and there's a little note there at the bottom of page 39 that just talks about a little bit about the history of the Ark of the Covenant, that it would be kept, and then eventually David's going to build the temple. He'll move the temple because this Ark of the Covenant is going to remain in this small village. It ends up in a small village, and that village becomes blessed. So the Philistine one had been cursed. This new village had been blessed. And then eventually David is going to take it from this village and bring it to Jerusalem after he makes Jerusalem the capital. And it's going to stand a tabernacle. And then Solomon's going to build the temple. And then they're going to take that Ark of the Covenant and put it in the temple where it remains until the final fall of Jerusalem, when King Nebuchadnezzar destroys Jerusalem, carries off the Ark of the Covenant. And that's the last place that it's ever mentioned in history. No one knows what happened to it at that point. But then we have a really powerful verse here in chapter 7, verse 3. This is the rise of Samuel, who leads a revival in Israel. And I'm going to read, we're going to talk a little bit about 7:12, but I'm going to read to you about the rise of Samuel. It says, from that day on, as I just said, from that day the ark remained at this village, which has a very long name, Kiriath Jearim. And the time was long, for it was 20 years, and the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. Then Samuel spoke to all the house of Israel, saying, if you return to the Lord, so this is Samuel talking to the people, if you return to the Lord, that is Yahweh, with all your heart, remove the foreign gods and the Ashereth. The Ashereth are just another one of those Philistine goddesses that they had adopted, and from among you, and direct your hearts to the Lord, and serve him alone, and he will deliver you from the hand of, guess who? The Philistines. Now the Ashereth, remember we talked about Hannah? What most women would do, pagan women, if you were barren, you know what you would do? You would go and give offerings to these idols. The Ashereth was one of the fertility goddesses. Anytime you hear that, if you go back to India these days, they have it everywhere. They have all these different things, and most of them are related to fertility, which is to have children. And that's what this Ashereth was a fertility goddess. So, when they heard this message from Samuel, the sons of Israel removed the Baals, that is the ones we talked about last week, the statues, the Ashereth, and served Jehovah alone. And then Samuel gathered all the people, and he said, I'll pray before you. And then it would go on. They would throw off the oppression of the Philistines as they'd done before, and the land would have rest. And Samuel would begin to offer burnt offerings, functioning as the priest for all the people. And it says at the end of chapter 17 that Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life, and he would go annually on this circuit between these three places. And we have here that he built something when he became the priest, the bottom of page 39. He built something called an Ebenezer. And this Ebenezer reminded people of this, that the Lord has helped us. So as this revival happens, they build this Ebenezer, which is a stone. By the way, Ebenezer literally just means stone of help, or help stone. And so that's what the Ebenezer, so he made this stone that just represented, like the altar when they crossed, you remember the Jordan River, they built this altar, and it wasn't to worship, it was to remind them of what had happened. So that's the difference between these altars and the pagan altars. Pagan authors, they didn't come there to worship God, or didn't see those stones as gods or carve in images of God. They were just stones that were raised up to remind the people to tell the stories of Jehovah God. So this stone of help. So that brings us in chapter 8 to the first king. And so after Samuel had been serving as the judge, as the priest, and he got older, he also had sons. And they looked at his sons, and you know what the people said? It's not going to work. They were also becoming corrupt. It's interesting. It makes you, as a parent, kind of worried. Don't you see this pattern over and over? The parents really working hard, and then the kids become corrupt. They take a lot of the things for granted. And so they tell Samuel something when he comes to Ramah. They tell him, we want a what? A king. We want to be ruled by a king. And their logic was this. Look at all the other people around us. They all have a king. This sounds like we're in junior high, doesn't it? If you have teenagers, everybody else has one. Well, we should have one too. And so he warned them. He says, look at these other countries you're talking about. If we have a king, he's going to put you into labor. He's going to charge taxes. He's going to bring out your sons to make them fight in battles. But yet they still say, and this is the next blank on the top of page 40, they still want a king to rule them so they can be like other nations. That is their response. And so then we get to chapter 10, and Samuel prays, and God leads him to a man in the town of Benjamin. If you remember in the time of the end of Judges, the tribe of Benjamin had almost been decimated. Do you remember the story? If you watched it online, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but you can, I'm sure, know the story. The tribe of Benjamin had become the worst tribe And they're the ones who had taken that concubine, that slave girl, and had raped her all night until she was dead. And then the priest then took her body and cut it into 12 pieces and sent it to all the other tribes and said, this is what the tribe of Benjamin has done. This evil has never been heard of in our nation. And so these other nations descend on Benjamin and massacre and kill a lot of them. And then they make a covenant. We will not allow the men in Benjamin to marry our daughters. And because of that, the tribe of Benjamin becomes very, very tiny and almost obsolete. Eventually, it just merges into the tribe of Judah. But, interestingly, how God does this, guess where the first king comes from? And as we see, when Samuel comes to Saul, he says, God wants you to be king. And this is what Saul says. I'm like the worst family in the smallest, most insignificant tribe in Israel. How can I be king? And of course, he does become king. And it says he was head and shoulders above all the other people. And as Saul was anointed, they gave sacrifices, and then Samuel gave them this warning in chapter 12, verses 24 through 25. He says, even though you have a king, what does it say up there? You must serve the Lord, or they, that is the people, and their king will be consumed. I'll read the exact passage here. Samuel told them, only fear the Lord, fear Jehovah, and serve him faithfully with all your heart. For consider what great things he has done for you. For if you will do wickedly, you will be swept away, both you and your king will be swept away. So the king was not in any way supposed to substitute for God and following God's ways. And of course, when you read in chapter 15, Saul starts off pretty well, and but he becomes filled with pride and other things, selfishness, and disobeys God. And it comes to fruition when, could you say, culminates with him waiting. He was supposed to go into battle, but he's supposed to wait for Samuel to arrive to do the sacrifices. And instead of waiting on Samuel, he said, we're in a hurry here. I don't have time to wait on God, so I'm just going to do it myself. So which he was forbidden in law for the king to do this. The king acted like the priest and did all the priestly duties before Samuel arrived, and then went into battle. And when that happened, and by the way, after he won the battle, he came back and made a big statue of, guess who? Himself. That's a bad sign. If our president starts making big, and that might happen, I don't know, a big statue of themselves, that's a bad sign that your leader has become self-absorbed and selfish and not focused on the right thing. So he does that, and God comes to Samuel, who is still the priest and the judge function. He says, I have rejected Saul and his descendants, and I'm going to choose a new king. And this is the famous passage, if you don't have this marked in your Bibles, in 1 Samuel chapter 16. This is one of the best chapters and the best stories, maybe my favorite story in the Old Testament. I'll give you a summary of the story. So God comes to Samuel, who's really sad because Saul has become such a loser, to use our president's words, and become such a loser, rejected God, the country's falling into decay, and God comes to Samuel and says, how long are you going to mourn over Saul? Get up, and I want you to go to the town of, and it's this small town that comes up over and over. What town is it? Bethlehem. I want you to go to Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse, the grandson of who? Ruth, who's the great-great-grandson of Rahab and her husband. I want you to go to Bethlehem. Go to the house of Jesse, who has 8 sons. I've chosen one of his sons to be king. And Samuel says, I can't do that. How often is that the response of people when God tells me? He said, I can't do that. If Saul finds out that I'm going to anoint a new king, he'll kill me. So God gives him a plan. He says, I want you to do this. Take an animal, a calf, and if anyone asks, why are you going to Bethlehem, just say, I'm going there to do a special sacrifice with the family of Jesse. So he does it. He brings a calf. He arrives in the village of Bethlehem, and everybody comes out, and they're all afraid, because usually if a prophet or priest comes, it's bad news. So they were worried. So they were all afraid. He says, don't worry. I've come in peace. I'm not going to curse you, not bring any fire down or anything like that. I've just come to use this calf and to do a sacrifice festival feast with the family of Jesse. So he goes to the house of Jesse. And then he tells Jesse, get all your sons. I'm going to anoint one of them as the king. And so his oldest son, he had 8 sons, 7 of them there. One was missing. The baby boy was missing. He was out with the animals. First one comes up, and Samuel, what does he say? This is the one. He's tall, handsome. He looks like, remember what Saul's description was? He was handsome, head and shoulders. He looked like that. He looked like a king. And the most famous verse, one of the most famous verses in the Old Testament, 16 verse 7. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord Jehovah looks at what? The heart. And so came the second son, no. Third son, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, no. And Samuel says, hold on a second, is this all your sons? He said, no, there's one more, but he's out with the animals. He says, we will not sit down until that son has been brought. He comes, of course, it's David. It says he's ruddy, which the best way to imagine that is just imagine you've been out working cows. You come back in, that's ruddy, right? You probably don't smell the best. Your hair's messed up, a little bit dirty, wind blown. Maybe you have your Carhartt jacket on we were talking about earlier. Comes in, and guess what God says? This is the one. So he anoints him, and it says that the Spirit of God was with David from that point on. And then we see, of course, after that story, Saul becomes tormented by, some people call it depression or schizophrenia, whatever it is. He has demonic sort of problems where he becomes upset. And David is not only a good shepherd, but he's a good musician. So they call in David to play the harp to soothe Saul. And then eventually David shows up at the battlefield where his 3 older brothers were serving as an army. And he ends up having a big famous battle with whom? With Goliath. And of course that begins really his trajectory, you could say, of prominence and fame among the people. Now turn over to page 41, our final page for today. As David grows in popularity, he's a great warrior, handsome, and they begin chants, that Saul has killed hundreds and David has killed thousands, and King Saul becomes very jealous and starts talking badly, starts on a couple of occasions, tries to kill David. Eventually, David runs out. Now, just in case you don't know, from the time David is anointed until the time he becomes king is about 15 years. So that's a long time, right? 15 years he was waiting. So he had this promise from God, and he had to wait 15 years until he saw the fulfillment of that promise when he was around 30. And then we have another interesting character, the page, top of 41. Saul's family wasn't all bad, was it? He had a son named Jonathan. Now, you would expect Jonathan, would you expect him to be good friends with David? Once he found out David was the anointed king, why not? Because he would be the one next in line. That's exactly right. So he was going to have to give up the throne for David. But they were such close friends. And Jonathan, it's just amazing sometimes how you can have these wonderful, godly people come out of rotten families. Have you ever known that to happen? It's amazing how God can do miracles like that. So that's we have a really rotten family, have God working in the life of a person who helps David, protects him, and of course helps him to escape from his father and protects him. And here we see, who is he? I skipped over that. Let me go ahead and give you the answer to that one. Who is Jonathan? He is the son of King Saul and a very dear friend, or as Gil said, a soul brother of David. And then we see in the battle with the Philistines, one of the reasons God rejected Saul was because God had told him to go, and the Amalekites, which I could put on that map up there, he said, I want you to totally wipe them out, push them totally out of the land. And Saul ends up doing it, but he doesn't completely do it, kind of like in the time of Joshua. And then guess who it is that ends up killing Saul? Well, we're going to hear this, the beginning of, as we transition to 2 Samuel. A messenger comes to David, and he says, the king has been killed, and his son have been killed. And David says, who are you? And who knows what his answer is? I'm a Amalekite. So that very one who brought the word and had killed King Saul, and had witnessed all that, was the very people that Saul was supposed to push out years before. Because of that disobedience, we see how that comes back around. And it's the Amalekite that ends up being a part of his death. And so that really brings us to the end of 1 Samuel with the death of Saul and Jonathan. And then 2 Samuel picks up with when David becomes king, with that story that we just talked about at the death of Saul. And you'll see there at the bottom of page 41, it has some summaries of the early part of the life of David, and that's just separated like that because they went along together. Of course, they overlapped, the early life of David and the rule of Saul. And as we mentioned earlier, that's the last blank we have here. Where was David born? In Bethlehem. And so, under Caesar Augustus, made a decree that everyone should return to the home of their father. So if you were of the family of David, guess what town is called the town of David, or city of David? Bethlehem, because it was where he was born. So we see that connection playing out a long time later in history, that's where Joseph, the adopted earthly father of Jesus, and Mary, both were of the family of David, had to return to Bethlehem. And I don't know if you saw me post that on Facebook, I think a few weeks ago. I read that somewhere. It's really fascinating that Bethlehem was not a busy town. So it would be unthinkable for all of the houses and all the inns in Bethlehem to be full at Christmas time. It would never have happened. So God, to make sure that all of them were full, every house was full, every inn was full, God used his power to influence the most powerful king in the world, Caesar Augustus, to make a decree to make sure that the day that Jesus, the eternal king, was born, there would be no room in Bethlehem because everybody had to come into town for this census. So God used the earthly king in his sovereign way to make sure that the heavenly king was laid in a what? Manger. Isn't that interesting to show, to make sure? And what was the sign of that he gave to the shepherds? You will find him wrapped in swaddling clothes, but you did that to every baby, right? So what was the real sign? He's laying in a manger, a feed trough. All right. That ends our study on 1 Samuel.